I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com.
So, Pat, you spoke to the man who's identified himself as a suspect in the murder of Mike Gaine. He was obviously arrested and released without charge, Michael Kelley. And people will probably have seen him in the papers before. Where is he living at the moment, and how is he? He's still in Kerry, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's living in Tralee now, and has been since his arrest took place back in May. And he's living a very quiet life.
Yeah.
He spends his days. He goes around to the local charity shops, literally going from charity shop to charity shop, looking for, cheap, inexpensive items. He's staying in state-supported accommodation in Tralee. He says he spends his days reading, and he also describes himself as an inventor of small machines. And he says that life has calmed down, that, he's very much out of the flurry of all the activity that happened after the murder of Mike Gaine.
Now, no doubt in terms of the arrest and release, out of the flurry, but still he's gone around a part of the country where presumably everybody who looks at him, even people who've never met him or exchanged words with him, know who he is. I mean, because the disappearance and the murder of Mike Gaine has been a huge story across the country, but in Kerry, where you're from yourself, I mean, it captured the public attention like no other crime, I think, in recent years.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's one of it has been a crime that has attracted more publicity than any of us can remember. It was a particularly macabre kind of a crime. Mike Gaine disappeared on March 20th. And from the very beginning of that, I think we all knew that there was something more to this than your average missing persons. There was huge Garda activity.
There was.
Almost from the get-go.
And I can see the figures, obviously, on the Indo newspapers and ours online. And straight away, that even within 24 hours of them going missing, like missing person stories, everybody sees them all the time. But there was a huge spike. And that's partly, I think, to do with the character of Mike Gaine as well. In that
it was. He was a very steady kind of a character. He was well known in his community. He was a sheep and cattle farmer. He was somebody that people described as a person who would always come out to help you. So he was never present in the community.
Yeah.
And then on this particular day, he went into his local Centra to buy phone credit.
Yeah.
And after that, he vanished.
Yeah.
Something that was so out of character. The red flags went up straight away.
Yes, because he wasn't one of these guys who have some sort of drink problems or something, who disappears periodically. And then, of course, what really made it instantly people fear that there was foul play was involved was the fact that his car was found and his wallet, I think, was in the car, wasn't it? And his phone. So that instantly, sparks an alert.
Well, it does, because the car with the wallet and the phone were found inside in the farmyard in Kerry East. And there was no sign of Mike Gaine.
Yeah.
In a very, very short space of time, there was huge Garda activity up on the farmyard. There was huge searches taking place. And obviously that was noted by the locals and obviously by the local media and subsequently by the national media.
Yeah.
Mike Gaine's case remained a missing persons case for several weeks before it was upgraded to a murder.
Yeah.
Now, there was only one other person living on the farm in Kerry East.
Yeah.
And that was this unusual kind of a character, Michael Kelley.
Now, from your interview with him, I think it's fair to call him unusual. Now, that, of course, being unusual doesn't make you a killer. Absolutely not.
Of
but
course.
like, he's not this standard sort of person that you would see, that it's just not the, even the stuff he's talking about.
He's not somebody you expect in the ordinary to find living below in Kenmare.
So, I mean, some of the interview, and I suppose the interview we highlighted, it looks at this, I suppose it's conspiracy theory stuff, isn't it, really? Like, he might say it's true, but it's what would be normally categorised as conspiracy. And he speaks about why he's in Kerry. And, obviously at one point you ask him, at this point he doesn't want to talk about Mike Gaine anymore, even though he did do a number of interviews initially, identifying himself as a suspect and speaking about being arrested. At this point he doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, at this point, Michael Kelley is more, he's happier to talk about himself and his own history. And I suppose that's a very interesting aspect of this story as well, because as you say, he's a very unusual character to find living down in Kenmare. Yeah. So we met Michael Kelley. He was just after doing a round of the charity shops in Tralee. He'd been inside in Duns. He walked out and I approached him. It was a wet day. Told him who I was, and initially he was like, he seemed reluctant to speak, but then I asked him what his plans were. Yeah. And suddenly suddenly it's like, a shadow lifted from his face. Yeah. You're not straight out talking to me about Mike Gaine. You want to know about me. Yeah. And he seems very happy to talk about himself. And he does have a very interesting history, because this is a guy who came to Ireland from the US 7 years ago, seeking asylum. Yeah. And people don't normally come to Ireland from the US seeking asylum.
No, I mean, you must be is there 2 or 3 a decade? Like,
I don't even know if there are. Yeah. I mean, he flew over here. He says that his history in the US is well known to an extent that there was issues in relation to family law issues that can be discussed over there that wouldn't ordinarily be public record over here. But Michael Kelley says that basically there was this rise of this movement called the alt-right over in the US, which is like a white nationalist movement that we've all become familiar with under Trump. So Michael Kelley says that he saw this group for what they were, that he saw them as fake patriots. Right. And that he also uncovered information in relation to child trafficking rings that he says went all the way to the top of the US government. And
which of course is an alt-right conspiracy in a sense, even though he's opposed.
Yes, but there's also the flip side of this, that what we've learned about Jeffrey Epstein since seems to reinforce the things that Michael Kelley was feeling at the time. Yeah. So Michael Kelley says he began speaking out against this online, and that his online conversation spilled over into real life, and that his dog got poisoned. Yeah. There was people doing wheelies in front of his house at night. There was shots being fired. Yeah. So Michael Kelley says that he began to fear for his life over there and decided that he was going to escape to Ireland. Yeah. And that's what he did. So flew into Dublin airport and straight away lodges an asylum application. Yeah. And he says he did this because he feared persecution over in the US by the alt-right, whether it was
or by Donald Trump in particular. Like he's vocal on what
he is. He's very vocal on Donald Trump, but he's also vocal on the Democrats. He says there's one big party, that all the political groups over in the US are this one big party, and that their focus, because he had spoken out against child trafficking and against this group that he was calling the fake patriots, he believed that their focus had turned on him. Right. Now, I did ask him. I said, "Look, fair enough, Michael, but you're an ex-military man from over in the US. Why is it you? I mean, there's plenty of people across the US who have spoken out on these issues." Yes, of course.
You might argue that there's people on Facebook ranting on at each other
constantly,
on a more or less constant basis.
Yeah, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we've all seen it. Yeah. But what Michael Kelley says made him different is that he says his father was in the CIA. Right. And I said, "So did your father tell you stuff?" And he was a little bit vague on it, but he went, "I might have found stuff." Okay. I went, so they were coming after you over this stuff. And he's kind of like, yeah, maybe.
Yeah. So that's his perspective. And you say to him this, or at least I'm paraphrasing you now, that this sounds all a bit conspiratorial, because he does go into Trump and he calls him a fascist and all of this.
Yeah, the rise of fascism in the US. Yeah, and look,
he's not alone in saying that.
He's not alone in saying that. But I did say to him, like, Michael Kelley is an educated man. He's somebody who's educated himself. He's somebody who reads a lot. I mean, his solicitor, Pat Mann, has said that this is an educated man. He spends some of his week is spent in the library in Tralee reading books. So he is an educated man. And because of that, I felt we could put it to him that, look, he has to be aware that there are people around the world who are becoming caught up in these conspiracy theories. And like we call it, being dragged down a rabbit hole. So I put that to him, and he wasn't offended by the question. He went, well, you can't ask me that. You have to judge that, because he said, I put my case to you. So you tell me if I've gone down the rabbit hole. And then he said, before you do that, he went, when I came to Ireland, I put all this in my asylum application. I put in about the rise of fascism, about Trump, and about these child trafficking rings. So he went, I put all this down years before this stuff has started coming out in the media. And we've all seen this stuff coming out in the media about Jeffrey Epstein. So in many ways, Michael Kelley would argue that the facts that subsequently transpired have proved that he's not a conspiracy theorist. And the things he warned about and the things he felt he was being persecuted for have come to pass.
Which, of course, there is, I think it's a Twitter page, conspiracy theories that prove to be true. And, he would say that this fits into it with the Epstein. But of course, that doesn't... The other part of it that he says is that him being directly targeted. I suppose that is something that still isn't verified, I suppose, by us. But he's put his case there.
Well, no, I think it was roundly rejected by us, because when he sought asylum, and he did seek asylum, and he ended up speaking to a solicitor over here to try and further that claim. The solicitor basically told him what he was saying was a non-runner, because he was coming from a country that is an ally of Ireland. So, like, the asylum claim was never going to wash.
No, I mean, you'd have to have a sort of a political persecution in a country that doesn't have a sort of steady rule of law. And of course, people can be skeptical about the American system, but I don't think it's not going to wash in an asylum application.
No, and the thing with Michael Kelley is that even when he came here, he says that the persecution didn't stop, that he doesn't drag Irish politicians or political parties into this conspiracy, but he does say that there's an Irish element to it, in that there are Irish criminals that he says would be the equivalent of the Hutches and the Kinahans, who are also involved.
He does read some newspapers anyway over here.
He appears very well informed when it comes to issues like that. Yeah.
So you spoke to him for how long?
We walked through the town, and he walks at quite a pace. I think we spoke for about 25 minutes, half an hour.
And all this time, he's not getting angry. He's not agitated or aggressive with you.
No, not at all. He was very, very polite, very well spoken, very eloquent. And if we weren't speaking to him in the context of the murder of Michael Gaine, it's somebody who you would find very, very interesting to speak to. You might walk away from it, forming your own opinions about whether you believe the things he says or not. But came across as somebody who you could quite easily sit down and have a cup of coffee or a pint with.
And so in that context, you put it to him, because he's an ex-soldier. I think his military record slightly disputed about what he did and what he didn't do. But you put it to him that, as you asked him, as somebody who's trained by the US military, presumably to use violence, is he capable of hurting another human? And he gives a sort of interesting answer.
With the background that you have, can I ask you, are you capable of hurting somebody? Oh, that's a general question. No, I'm not.
Look in the mirror, man. Are you?
I don't know. I don't think I'd be capable of hurting a human being. No.
Okay.
What about you?
Why would I be different to you?
Oh, well, that's why I'm asking. He does, yeah. He said, well, you look in the mirror. Why would I be any different to you? And I said, well, because you have received this training, and he has received military training. I asked him about that, and he said, yeah, he was he was a former member of the U.S. Army. He said he would have been a member of the army back during the Iraq War. He said that he looked to be discharged from the army because he felt that the US's military's conduct in Iraq was dishonorable. And I asked him, was he in Iraq? He said he wasn't, that he was actually stationed over in Germany and that he was guarding missiles over there. So yeah, the natural question to ask him is would he view himself as somebody who would be capable of hurting another human being? And eventually he said, look, anybody is capable of hurting anybody in certain circumstances. So
he also says, interestingly, it's like, he says any man is capable of violence due to the fact he's a man. Interestingly, he says, it's like asking a woman if she's capable of being unfaithful. It's a moral trap. Everybody is capable. It's more or less down to the circumstances.
Yeah, and I'm not sure where that came from. It did seem a comment that didn't fit the context of the conversation. But we do know that Michael Kelley has had issues with women in the past. And again, that's something that I suppose you can't ignore if you're asking about Michael Kelley's credibility. Because back in 2009, there was a family law dispute over in the US involving Michael Kelley's two children with a lady called Alicia Snow, and basically Michael Kelley was making the argument that he felt that Alicia Snow was he wanted custody, and during the course of that dispute, he alleged that Alicia Snow was a witch. And the judge found that
not a hippy dippy witch either. It was a good old satanic witch, wasn't it?
Well, that's what he said the last day. But in the court papers that we found, it was an allegation that she was practicing witchcraft. And the judge in that case found that Alicia Snow was somebody who was well suited and a fit person to be, the guardian of the two children, whereas his judgment of Michael Kelley was a lot less charitable. And he said he was somebody who he felt had difficulty distinguishing fact from fiction. And I did ask Michael Kelley about that the last day. I said, look, you accused the mother of your two children of being a witch. I went, what did you mean by that? And he went, well, she is a witch. I went, what do you mean by witch? And he said, yeah, it's real. You know, a satanic witch, it's real. And then he kind of pulled back and he said, well, I said she was a self-proclaimed witch, that she was proclaiming herself to be a witch. And I said, well, but the judge said you have difficulty distinguishing fact from fiction. And then he seemed to lose his cool a bit. He was saying that this judge, I had a judge recused from that case. And, the case was so biased that afterwards the bailiff came out and apologized to me. Now, whether that's an accurate reflection of what happened back then, I mean, the court papers tell us one story. Michael Kelley obviously feels very sore about what happened back then. So maybe that's linked back to his comment in relation to women.
And of course, the court papers ultimately are the thing that's on the record, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Now, when you asked him, had he hurt Michael Gaine, he gives a clear answer about that. Yeah,
it was like, no. And then it was like, but I told you I'm not going to talk to you about that. Now, he didn't actually tell me that anything was off the record because we don't operate like that. But I think he took this view that was the rule that he'd taken with other journalists along the way. So it was almost like an unwritten rule in a conversation that he was going to have with me. But, we didn't feel bound by what questions we could and couldn't ask him.
And it's an interesting case, of course, for many reasons. But one of the reasons that we are able to sit down here and talk about Michael Kelley is that he's done something where he's declared himself a suspect. Now, many hundreds of articles you've written and I've written as well, where we've had to say the chief suspect, the man, the man in his 30s or whatever, for legal reasons, we haven't been able to name somebody. Now, obviously, Michael Kelley is being named as a result of him naming himself.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an unusual thing to do, isn't it?
It is, but it's not. I suppose it's not. It's not that unusual either. There has been cases previously,
yes,
where people have identified themselves as the suspect in the case. There has been people who seem to enjoy the limelight before it turns against them. I mean, if you go back and you look at the murder of Tina Satchwell, and you look at Richard Satchwell couldn't get enough airtime after Tina Satchwell disappeared. And similarly to Michael Kelley, in the beginning of this, Michael Kelley spoke freely when he was approached by journalists. I think he was approached by one of my colleagues from another newspaper and his response was, "I should be charging for photographs."
Yeah.
So he was somebody who enjoyed the publicity in the beginning, which is something that must have been very, very hurtful for Mike Gaine's family to see this guy, walking the streets of Tralee, somebody that, described himself as a suspect in the killing. But again, it's something we've seen before. You look at Richard Satchwell. Richard Satchwell was, answering phone calls to every journalist in the country. He was turning up for television appearances. And then when he realized that, this media focus, it's not actually helping me. Richard Satchwell's approach to the whole thing disappeared, wouldn't take phone calls, went running whenever he saw a journalist. And to an extent, maybe that's something that is now happening with Michael Kelley as well, where he's become much more reluctant to speak to the media.
And of course, the other classic example is Ian Bailey, who identified himself as a suspect and continued to carry out interviews for the rest of his life.
Right up until his death. And he was in hospital after a heart attack shortly before he died, and then went on even to do his own podcast.
And of course, the things that make those things similar is that there are three men who've identified themselves as a suspect. The outcome of those cases and what they did, there's no necessarily any similarities at all, but it's the fact that they've publicly identified themselves as
absolutely. Well, I mean, in the case of Ian Bailey, that case was never solved. In the case of Richard Satchwell, it was, it took a huge amount of time and some very unusual aspects to that before Tina's body was found. And in the case of Michael Gaine, we still don't know what happened with Michael Gaine.
And so we've spoken about, obviously, the Mike Gaine case on this podcast. It is a very, very challenging case for the guards to solve at this point, for a number of reasons, isn't it? I mean, you've been up at the farm. I mean, it's an isolated place, so you're not going to get CCTV witnesses, any of that. I mean, that is a real challenge for the gardaí, isn't it?
Yeah, there is no CCTV beyond what came out in the initial stages.
Yeah.
There was the circumstantial evidence that regarding the car being found there, regarding the wallet and the phone, and the fact that Michael Gaine was living on the property, and then following the discovery, the tragic discovery on May 16th of the remains, when a family member and an agricultural contractor were spreading the slurry, and then there was various different implements, which may have been weapons used, recovered since, and now it's at the stage where it largely revolves around technical examinations and whatever follow-up inquiries the guards can make, but we don't know at this stage what the next step in this will be.
No, because look, obviously it was a source of public controversy, the fact that Mike Gaine's remains were only found in this slurry tank a number of weeks after, and I think there is an investigation into how that happened. That hasn't been made public, or hasn't.
Drew Harris said there could be learnings from it.
Exactly, and we don't know what those learnings are. If they have been, it got at the point that they know what they are, and it's not public, or they haven't got at that point yet. But that is obviously it's going to complicate this case, because you're speaking about, Mike Gaine being dismembered, but we don't know when or how, or, and it's going to be made more complicated due to the fact that it took a number of weeks to find his body parts.
Yeah, it's it is an extremely difficult case.
Yeah.
But you also have to look at it in the context that it was an extremely challenging scene.
Yes.
Because it wasn't just simply focused on the barn or the small area around the farmyard. If you think back, the guards were searching a massive area of land. And in the beginning, the guards didn't know for a fact that this was a murder investigation. I mean, there was a possibility that, Mike Gaine had left the farm walking, although I think there was talk at the time that he had his mobility there was mobility issues, so the thinking was that he wouldn't have gone far. But the guards still had to search this vast area of land. And I remember when we were down there in the early stages, we saw the drones going up, we saw all the search and rescue teams out, and they were combing an extraordinary area of land. So I don't think that I don't think it's a case where any member of the Gardaí would be saying this was the perfect investigation. No. But I think until the outcome of a review into that investigation, maybe it's a bit unfair to make assumptions.
Exactly. I mean, we don't know what they are, but we do know, and it's fair to say, it's going to complicate.
Absolutely.
Now, you're from not too far away from there. What's been the impact on the local area, and are people, I suppose that there's been a bit of the huge interest always, and a lot of the media decamping. Has that been an issue for people, or do they?
I think in the immediate aftermath, there was shock, and there was horror about what was coming out in Camara, and that this had happened to somebody like Mike Gaine, who was such an integral part of the community. He was involved in rallying, and that sense of horror remains when it comes to the aspect around Mike Gaine. But in terms of Michael Kelley, I think people have taken a wait and see attitude. It's something. I remember being down in West Cork, and people who interacted with Ian Bailey were saying, well, we don't know that Ian Bailey did anything wrong. And there was there was almost a feeling amongst the local people down there. There was some sympathy for him, because it was a case of, well, what if he's being accused in the wrong? And I think that's something down in Tralee. Like I know people down in Tralee. When Michael Kelley was moved into accommodation in the centre of Tralee town after his arrest, people in Tralee were horrified. They were like, why is he being put in here? And they were worried and they were fearful. They didn't know what to expect. But familiarity does breed a certain
comfort, maybe.
It does, and he was subsequently moved out of that part of town, and he's living in a different part of town now. And Michael Kelley says that people in Tralee haven't been mean to him. He hasn't made any friends because people are still very cautious of him. But he says he's allowed to. He's allowed to go about his business without interference below in Tralee, and he has no plans of leaving.
No, but I suppose to get to that finally, so he's applied for asylum, it's been turned down. Do we know if he's continuing to appeal, or, No,
he's done with the asylum part.
So that's all come to a conclusion?
No, but now he's applying for naturalisation. So he's accepted that he's never going to be granted asylum after coming here from the US. But he says that more than half of his family, going back 3 generations, were Irish citizens. So he is hopeful that he will be granted his Irish citizenship.
The granny rule, basically, is it?
It worked. Yeah,
it worked for some footballers.
Tony Gascarino. So
But if he's talking 3 generations back, he might be on shakier ground, would he?
No, I think he's saying going back 3 generations. So he's not going all the way back to his great grandparents. He's saying there's Irish people in his lineage going back, through successive generations.
So that all takes a bit of time, but I mean, people can be deported, can't they? So at the moment, he's, as far as we know, he will be
remains a suspect.
He remains a suspect, and he probably isn't getting even the dole, is he? He
said he is receiving support,
some sort of payments
from the government. He said he's receiving a small amount of assistance from the Irish state, and he says he can live, if not comfortably, he can live frugally on that.
Yeah. Well, look, Pat, it's there's huge interest in the case, so we're going to have to keep coming back to it. But it's a complicated one for sure, and we can only hope that Mike Gaine's family and his wife, I think, kind of was encouraged to speak out. I only hope that they do get the justice that they deserve.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Pat.